You've probably heard that the United States gives Israel foreign aid money. In 2020, Israel received $3.8 billion, more than almost any other country. But why does the US keep giving money to Israel, and what does it get in return? For years, opinion polls have shown that Americans vastly overestimate how much of their country's budget goes to foreign aid. Many think it's around 25%. In fact, it's less than 1%, or about $40 billion a year, give or take. That aid falls into three main categories: humanitarian, economic, and military. Israel gets almost exclusively military aid. But this money comes with strings attached. It isn't a cash handout. Instead, it's what's called foreign military finance grants. Simply put, the US is very good at manufacturing military equipment, and they want other countries to buy it from them. So they give those countries money to do just that, kind of like a gift certificate. For example, Israel bought 50 F-35 jets from the United States, mostly paid for by these foreign military finance grants. This money goes right back into the US economy, translating into jobs in manufacturing, engineering, and other fields. Foreign aid is just one piece of a complex and tight-knit military relationship between the US and Israel that evolved out of the two countries' shared geopolitical interests, security concerns, and core values. Israel looks after a stockpile of American weapons and ammunition, which they can also use themselves in an emergency, and Israel helps the US with cybersecurity, anti-terrorist activities, and a whole lot more. That's why some analysts, like Professor Eitan Gilboa, don't think it's fair to compare Israel to other countries who accept billions in American foreign aid. Between 2015 and 2020, Afghanistan, Iraq, Jordan, and Egypt usually received between $1 and $9 billion annually in US aid each. And while each of these countries receives some military aid, they also get hundreds of millions of dollars for economic development and humanitarian assistance, which Israel doesn't. Notably, the West Bank and Gaza received $235 million in 2021, which is entirely humanitarian and economic aid. Two-thirds of the money goes to UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine refugees, with the rest going to the Palestinian Authority directly. Because of how Israel is given this money, some experts prefer to compare Israel's aid to American military spending. Consider two of the countries with the most US military bases abroad, South Korea and Japan. Between 2016 and 2019, it cost American taxpayers more than $3 billion a year to keep forces on the ground in South Korea. In Japan, it costs more than $5 billion. America's investment in those countries is very similar to its investment in Israel. It's keeping tabs on potentially volatile neighboring countries, whether it's North Korea and China in East Asia or Syria and Iran in the Middle East. But things weren't always like this. In 1973, America earmarked $492 million in foreign aid to Israel. The next year, that number almost quintupled to $2.6 billion. What happened in between was the Yom Kippur War. In October 1973, Egypt and Syria launched a surprise attack against Israel, backed by billions of dollars worth of weapons and ammo from the Soviet Union. In response, the US quickly launched Operation Nickel Grass. They flew more than 22,000 tons of weapons and ammunition to Israel, helping the underdog Jewish state win the war and staving off destruction. Various White House administrations started pouring American money into the Middle East around this time to combat Soviet influence. But Israel stood out. US presidents understood the need to maintain Israel's qualitative military edge, a commitment to make sure Israel has better weapons than its hostile neighbors. The two countries formalized this relationship with a pact called the Strategic Cooperation Agreement, signed by Ronald Reagan's administration in 1981, which aimed to deter Soviet threats in the Middle East. Alexander Haig, Reagan's Secretary of State, summarized this relationship from the American point of view when he said, "Israel is the largest, most battle-tested, and cost-effective U.S. aircraft carrier that cannot be sunk, does not carry even one U.S. soldier, and is located in a most critical region for U.S. national security." In the 1990s, after the Soviet Union collapsed and Iraq invaded Kuwait, the U.S. became an active military force in the Middle East, and again required a strong local ally. Then, 9/11 pushed Israel and the U.S. even closer together. It's easy to see how decades of shared values and goals would cement a partnership between the two countries. But underlying this history is one important fact. None of this foreign policy would have been viable unless the American public approved of supporting Israel. In general, Americans have been highly in favor of Israel for the last few decades. Both Republican and Democratic politicians tend to agree that giving Israel foreign aid is a smart move. That's not to say there's unanimous agreement. Some on the progressive left have recently argued that aid to Israel should at least be conditional. In April 2021, Democratic House Representative Betty McCollum introduced a bill that would deny Israel aid money if it was spent on detaining children, seizing Palestinian property, or annexing land in the West Bank. It's hard to prove any of the money is used for that. Again, it's mostly grants that are to be spent back in the United States. Regardless, the bill is unlikely to pass. Meanwhile, Israelis, for the most part, also approve of receiving U.S. aid, though some critics have argued it makes Israel too dependent on America.
Those businesses in Israel are going out of business because we're dependent on the U.S.
They also point out that the U.S. has a clear interest in selling military equipment to as many countries as possible. That's a fair point. As a side deal to the Abraham Accords of 2020, the United States sold $23 billion in weapons, including cutting-edge F-35s, to the United Arab Emirates. If you look back in history, you'll find U.S. aid is often tied to Middle Eastern peace deals, like the one between Israel and Egypt. But regardless of any side deals, it is very likely the U.S. will continue to ensure Israel has the upper hand in the region. Their relationship is mutually beneficial and popular among voters. As a global superpower, the United States has an obligation to maintain stability, form strategic partnerships with like-minded nations, and stave off aggressive actors. When it comes to the Middle East, that means keeping Israel a linchpin of American foreign policy.